Lesson 4.3, Right Triangle Trigonometry. Alright, so we just learned about the trigonometric functions on the unit circle in the last lesson. This lesson we're talking about them as right triangles. So on this right triangle we have an angle marked. The side on the other side of the triangle is called the opposite side. The leg touching the angle is the adjacent, and the hypotenuse is always the longest side. It's always opposite the right angle. The formulas for our trig functions: sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over a hypotenuse, tangent's opposite over adjacent, and then the reciprocals: cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite, secant is hypotenuse over adjacent, and cotangent is adjacent over opposite. Usually we just memorize these first three and just remember the secant, cosecant, and cotangent are reciprocals. A way to remember that is SOHCAHTOA. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Alright, in this problem we want to find the value of the 6 trig functions of angle A. Well, first of all, we need to find the length of the hypotenuse. We can use the Pythagorean theorem. 5 squared plus 12 squared equals the hypotenuse squared. So that's 169, I think, equals the hypotenuse squared. So take a square root, and the hypotenuse is 13. All right, sine of our angle is the opposite over the hypotenuse, so that would be 12 over 13. Cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, so opposite, adjacent is touching it, it's the leg touching, and then our hypotenuse. So adjacent is 5 over 13. Tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. The opposite is 12, the adjacent is 5. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. It's the hypotenuse over the opposite. So it'd be 13 over 12. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so it's the hypotenuse over the adjacent. It's 13 over 5. And cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, so it's the adjacent over the opposite, which is 5 over 12. There are some special right triangles that give us be useful for finding sine, cosine, and tangent of the special angles. The first one's a 45, 45, 90, or pi over 4, pi over 4, pi over 2 for in radians. And notice the sides are 1 and 1, it's isosceles, square root of 2, 1, 1, square root of 2. The other one is a 30, 60, 90, or pi over 6, pi over 3, pi over 2. And its sides go 1, 2, square root of 3, where 2 is the hypotenuse. So let's find sine of pi over 4. Sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. So pi over 4, the opposite is 1, and the hypotenuse is square root of 2. Have to rationalize that, so it's square root of 2 over 2. Cosecant. Cosecant is the hypotenuse over the opposite. So from the pi over 3, the hypotenuse is 2, and the opposite is square root of 3. Have to rationalize that, so it's 2 square root of 3 over 3. And then tangent of 30 degrees. Tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. So from the 30 degrees, the opposite is 1, and the adjacent is square root of 3. Have to rationalize that. Can't have a square root in the bottom. So it's square root of 3 over 3. All right, so sketch a right triangle and find the other 5 trig functions. All right, tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. So if I make it a fraction, it'd be 3 over 1. So the opposite would be 3, and the adjacent would be 1. All right, we need to find the hypotenuse. So 3 squared plus 1 squared equals the hypotenuse squared using the Pythagorean theorem. 10 is the hypotenuse squared, so the hypotenuse is the square root of 10. All right, so sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. The opposite is 3. Hypotenuse was square root of 10. We have to rationalize. So it's 3 square root of 10 over 10. Cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. The adjacent was 1. Hypotenuse is square root of 10. Rationalize it. So it's square root of 10 over 10. Tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. The opposite is 3, adjacent is 1, which is 3. Oh, right, they gave that one to us. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. It's the hypotenuse over the opposite. So it's square root of 10 over 3. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. It is the hypotenuse over the adjacent. So it's square root of 10 over 1, which is just the square root of 10. And cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, so it's the adjacent over the opposite. The adjacent is 1, the opposite is 3.